Welcome back to Eerie Hour. Tonight we are venturing deep into the ancient heart of the Appalachian Mountains with 10 of the most disturbing true deep woods horror stories ever documented. These chilling accounts come directly from park rangers, loggers, hunters, and longtime mountain locals who came face to face with something in those dark hollows that forever changed them. Each story has been checked against police records, missing person files, and first-hand testimony. What you are about to hear represents the darkest side of America's oldest mountain range, a place where endless isolation feeds horrors beyond understanding, and the line between the wild and the civilized fades away. If this is your first time listening to Eerie Hour, make sure to subscribe now for daily true horror tales that will haunt your sleep. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the shadows whisper your name. Now, let us descend into the shadow depths of Appalachian territory, where ancient secrets wait in silence, and survival depends on never leaving the safety of the light. I worked for the United States Forest Service in western North Carolina for 15 years, spending most of that time patrolling the most hidden and untouched parts of the Blue Ridge Mountains. My assigned area covered nearly 40,000 acres of wild forest, including sections of the Nantahala National Forest that see fewer than a dozen visitors in a whole year. These were places where the mountain laurel grew so thick you couldn't see 5 feet in front of you, where streams ran ice cold through valleys that had never heard a chainsaw, and where the silence was so heavy that your own heartbeat felt painfully loud. The Appalachian Mountains are unimaginably old. Scientists say they are among the oldest mountains on Earth, worn down over millions of years into soft peaks and deep valleys that still hide secrets no one remembers. In my years of service, I walked trails that were nothing more than narrow game paths, followed markers that hadn't been checked in decades, and explored forests so far off maps that new species of plants and animals were still being found there. It was everything I had dreamed of as a child, mixing my love of the outdoors with the duty to protect lands that time itself had almost forgotten. But nothing in my training could have prepared me for some of the things I would eventually see. Strange things that made me understand why the old mountain families spoke in hushed voices about certain hollows, why some hunters would refuse to guide clients into specific valleys, and why local families kept their own quiet rules about never crossing certain ridgelines once night fell. In late September of 2018, I was sent out on a simple boundary survey in a section of forest close to the Tennessee border, an area no one had officially surveyed since the 1940s. The record suggested there might be property disputes, maybe old mining claims or abandoned cabins that had never been filed correctly. My task was to walk the boundary lines, mark GPS coordinates, and record anything unusual. The area could only be reached by an old logging road that hadn't seen a vehicle in at least 20 years. I left my truck at the end of the broken road and hiked about 6 miles through dense forest, following compass points and old survey markers so faded they were nearly lost to moss and time. The tree canopy was so thick that even though it was midday, the ground stayed in near twilight, only the occasional sunbeam breaking through. By noon, I reached what should have been the northwestern corner of Forest Service land. There should have been metal posts and marked trees, but what I found was entirely different. Instead of government posts, I came across wooden stakes driven deep into the earth, each one carved with strange symbols I had never seen before. They weren't Native American markings, which I was familiar with, and they weren't the usual signs hunters or loggers left behind. These were complex, carefully cut symbols, carved with skill and intention. Some looked like twisted tree roots, others almost like a language I couldn't recognize. The posts stretched out in a long line through the forest, clearly marking some kind of border, though none of my maps mentioned it. I followed this strange boundary for nearly a mile, taking photos and logging GPS points, thinking maybe I had stumbled on old property markers that had never been recorded. But then I began to notice other signs, trees with branches cut in exact patterns, bark peeled away in odd shapes, and small stone stacks placed at precise intervals. Someone had built and maintained all of this, and they had been there for a long time. Yet every official record showed this land as empty. As I moved deeper, the evidence became clearer. Game trails had been widened into pathways, logs carefully cleared, and even drainage channels built from stone. Someone had turned these wild animal tracks into real trails, and done it with skill. Following one of these paths, I started to smell smoke, faint at first, mixed with the scent of rotting leaves. but stronger as I climbed a steep ridge that wasn't on any of my maps. When I reached the top, I saw something I'll never forget. Below me lay a hidden valley, round and enclosed on all sides by steep ridges that made it completely invisible unless you stood exactly where I was. A clear stream ran through the middle, and patches of forest had been thinned to form open meadows, while large trees had been left standing as though chosen with care. It was breathtaking, like a secret world, untouched by time. But what I saw inside chilled me to the bone. There were buildings scattered through the valley, but not like normal cabins. They were made entirely from natural forest materials, shaped so carefully that they seemed to grow out of the earth itself. Their walls curved like tree trunks. Their roofs were covered in moss and vines. It was eerie, almost beautiful. But it wasn't the buildings that horrified me. In the open spaces between them, there were ritual sites. Circles of standing stones surrounded bare patches of ground, and at the center of each circle stood wooden frames decorated with preserved animal remains. At first I thought they were scarecrows or strange totems, but as I watched, I realized they were the bodies of deer, boar, bear, and smaller animals. They had been bound to the wooden frames, preserved to last, and arranged in unnatural, almost human poses. Some were combined with branches, plants, and stones to form disturbing figures that looked half animal, half something else. Then, movement. People began stepping out of the hidden structures, men, women, and children, all dressed in handmade clothes of animal skins and woven plants. Their hair was long, unkempt, and their movements strange, slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. They gathered around the animal frames, and what I saw next froze me in place. They treated the preserved bodies as if they were alive, speaking to them, touching them, even seeming to worship them. Children as young as 6 or 7 joined in without hesitation, touching rotting hides as though it was natural. In that moment, I realized this was no ordinary camp. This was a hidden community, people who had lived in isolation for so long that they had built their own culture, their own faith, their own way of life, something outside the reach of anything we would call normal. But as I watched, one of them suddenly turned its head and looked straight up at me. I was hidden in thick brush hundreds of yards away, yet somehow they knew. The entire group froze, then moved quickly and with coordination, as if this moment had been expected. Within minutes, I heard movement in the forest around me. They knew the land, they knew the routes, and they were cutting off my escape. Panic set in. I abandoned stealth, crashing through underbrush, leaping over fallen trees, running toward my truck as fast as I could. Behind me, the sounds grew closer, not random chasing, but organized, like hunters driving prey into a trap. By the time I saw my truck through the fading light, my lungs were on fire. I dove inside, started the engine with shaking hands, and didn't stop driving until I reached safety. That night, I wrote my report in full detail, complete with GPS locations and photos. 3 days later, a team went out to investigate. They found nothing. The carved posts were gone, the stone piles knocked over, the paths disguised again as simple animal tracks, and the valley itself showed no trace of people or buildings. Officially, my report was written off as evidence of abandoned hunting camps or maybe locals trespassing without permits. The case was closed with a note suggesting more patrols, but I knew the truth of what I had seen, and I knew that somewhere out there in those endless mountains, there are still people living by rules that the rest of the world left behind long ago. People who will do anything necessary to stay hidden. 6 months later, I requested a transfer to another district, and I have never returned to Western North Carolina. It started with Camera Station 7, placed high on a ridge looking over the main trail that the elk used to reach the valley. At first, the camera worked as expected, capturing clear pictures of elk and deer both during the day and at night. But when I checked the memory card after 5 days, I found a series of photographs that did not make sense. The images showed a tall figure standing about 50 yards from the lens, half hidden by trees and thick brush. The figure looked somewhat human in shape, but it was much taller than any person, with proportions that felt strangely off. The pictures were taken just before dawn, when light was limited, but the infrared flash revealed that the figure's body was covered in thick hair or fur. At first, I thought maybe the camera had caught a black bear standing on its hind legs, since bears sometimes do that to sniff the air. But something wasn't right. The shoulders, arms, and even the neck looked more human than animal, only stretched to a massive scale, making it seem like the creature stood over 7 feet tall. The most unsettling part was that the figure seemed to be staring straight into the lens. In all 6 photos, it faced the camera directly, almost as if it knew it was being photographed and wanted to be seen. At first, I tried to brush it off as a camera glitch or a strange double exposure, but when I checked the other cameras, I discovered nearly identical images at 3 different stations. Each one showed the same large, upright figure captured within the same period of time, proving it was moving through the forest in a deliberate way that brought it into the range of several cameras in a single night. That thought alone was chilling. My cameras were set up along trails that were miles apart, separated by rough ground that was difficult even for me to cross in daylight. For something to trigger 4 separate stations in one night, it had to know the land with perfect detail and move through the dark without needing paths or light. But what disturbed me most wasn't just the figure itself, but the pattern revealed by the photos. Checking the timestamps, I realized it had traveled from Station 12 to Station 7, then to Station 3, and finally to Station 9, creating a rough circle that completely surrounded my camp. It wasn't moving randomly. It was circling me, testing approaches from all sides while staying just out of sight. Over the next few weeks, the same thing kept happening, only worse. The figure showed up more often, and each time it seemed closer to camp. At first it lingered far at the edges, barely caught by the camera's flash, but the later shots placed it squarely in the center of the frames, moving in closer and closer. The images also began to show disturbing new details. In some, the figure appeared to be holding branches or even tools, moving them in ways that looked intentional. In others, it was seen touching my gear, pressing against camera housings, pulling at the cables I had locked them with, almost testing them. The most shocking came from Station 3, where, over 5 nights, the photos showed it building something. It gathered branches and rocks, arranging them carefully into a crude structure across from the lens. The finished object looked like a hunting blind, designed so anyone inside it could watch the trail while staying hidden. It was proof of planning, proof of construction, and proof that whatever it was, it understood how to conceal itself. By my 6th week out there, I was seeing signs of it everywhere. Game trails showed massive footprints that were clearly from something walking upright, but far too large to belong to any human. Trees had strange scratches, claw marks at heights no local animal could possibly reach. Even stranger were the new arrangements of stones and branches I began finding around my camp, carefully stacked, positioned, almost ritual-like. They served no obvious purpose, but someone or something had built them deliberately. The weight of knowing I was being watched constantly grew heavier by the day. I was completely alone, 15 miles from the nearest road, and whatever was out there wasn't just wandering, it was studying me. My cameras had weeks of evidence that showed it circling, creeping closer, and preparing for something more direct. The final straw came in my 8th week. I woke one morning before dawn to find that one of my cameras had been moved. Station 5, which had been mounted to a tree just 20 feet from my tent, was now attached to a different tree directly facing my camp. It had been carefully repositioned at eye level, giving it a perfect view of where I slept. When I pulled the card, I found dozens of pictures of myself inside my tent, taken throughout the night from less than 10 feet away. Somehow, it had entered camp, handled my gear without waking me, and sat watching me sleep for hours. Worse still, the images showed moments when the thin fabric of my tent bulged inward, as if something was brushing its hand along the outside. Other photos showed my belongings spread out in new patterns, rearranged like a child sorting toys. That morning, I packed what I could and left everything else behind. I hiked straight out of the valley, abandoning thousands of dollars of equipment because survival mattered more than gear. When I later returned with park rangers to retrieve what was left, the place was unrecognizable. Every camera had been torn apart, every memory card taken. My tent was shredded into ribbons, my camp gear thrown across the forest floor as though ripped apart by something with enormous strength. The official report claimed it was the work of bears. The photographs, they said, must have been wildlife captured at strange angles. But I know what I saw, and I know what those 8 weeks revealed. Something lives deep in the Monongahela wilderness, something intelligent enough to use tools, to build, to watch, and to choose when to show itself. The Appalachian Mountains have always hidden families and communities that do things their own way, apart from the modern world. But perhaps not all of them are fully human anymore. My evidence was taken by the very thing it captured, and I have never gone back. I no longer work alone in remote places because I learned the hard way. Some things should never be followed, and some parts of the mountains are not meant to be explored. Music. I have worked as a cave rescue specialist for Virginia and Tennessee's state emergency teams for 18 years, pulling more trapped cavers out of the Appalachian underground than I can count. These mountains are full of limestone caverns stretching for hundreds of miles, twisting into a hidden world that most people never see. Some are tourist caves with handrails and lights, but many are wild systems no one has fully mapped. Cave rescues demand more than gear. They demand instinct, training, and a sense for underground terrain that can shift without warning. I have followed freezing rivers through tunnels no wider than my shoulders, climbed into black voids where one wrong move meant a fall no one could survive, and pulled broken bodies out of chambers that took half a day to reach. The Appalachian caves are especially unpredictable because they were carved by water over millions of years, splitting into webs of tunnels that sometimes run for miles beyond the nearest entrance. Some drop hundreds of feet into darkness. Others hold underground rivers that can swell in minutes during a storm above. That danger makes rescues brutal, but it also means we often stumble into sections no one has ever mapped before. In November of 2017, I was called to an emergency in Blackwater Cave, a system tucked away in the Jefferson National Forest near the Tennessee border. 2 experienced cavers had vanished while exploring beyond the mapped area. Blackwater got its name from the stream that cuts through its passages, the water darkened by tannins from the forest above. The entrance is hidden in a tight valley, hard to reach, and the interior is known for passages that split again and again until even experts can lose themselves. When I arrived with my team of 4, the missing men's car was still parked at the trailhead. They had packed gear for about 12 hours of exploration, but had been gone more than 24. And in the constant 50-degree chill of the cave, hypothermia was a real threat. We geared up and moved in, keeping radios linked to our surface crew. The main mapped route wound through wide chambers and narrow crawlways barely a foot and a half high, slowing us to a crawl as we searched every side tunnel for signs of the men. 6 hours in, we reached the end of the known map with no trace. But there, we discovered the cave went far deeper. The underground river cut straight into a tunnel no chart had ever shown. The space was massive, taller than our lights could reach, the floor smoothed by centuries of flowing water. And on the walls, we saw something none of us expected. Rows of carved handholds and footholds, cut neatly into the stone. They formed a rough ladder leading deeper into the black, proof that someone, long before us, had been there, shaping the underground by hand. As we followed the altered passage deeper into the cave, we began to notice signs that people had lived there for a very long time. Some of the tunnels had been widened by hand tools, shaped into larger rooms that looked like they were made to be used as living spaces. Walls of stone had been built to split these chambers into different sections, and even rough furniture had been carved directly from the rock. The most unsettling discovery came when we reached areas clearly meant for storing food. There were smoke, and dried meats, along with preserved vegetables, enough to feed dozens of people for a long period of time. Whoever had lived there wasn't just surviving. They had created a system to support a whole community underground. In other chambers, we found signs of work and trade. One room looked like a workshop with tools and weapons made from salvaged metal, while another had crude looms and spinning wheels crafted from stalagmites and scavenged parts, showing that they had been making their own textiles. The discovery that shook us most was when we found the sleeping areas themselves. Beds had been carved into the walls at different heights, almost like bunk beds stacked into the stone, enough to house many families. Niches carved into the walls held personal belongings, and everything about the place showed that people had been living there very recently. Fires still held warmth, and food was still fresh. Yet the entire place was empty, as if everyone had vanished suddenly, leaving everything behind without even bothering to cover their tracks. As we pressed further in, looking for the missing cavers, it became clear that the community went much deeper than we thought. The chambers stretched into multiple levels, all connected with carved passages that made movement easy between them. What we had stumbled into was not just a few hidden rooms, but a full underground settlement that could have housed 50 or 60 people comfortably. More troubling was the discovery that these people had been watching the world above them. In one chamber, we found hand-drawn maps of the surrounding forests and towns, along with detailed notes that seemed to track hikers, hunters, and visitors in the area. Another chamber contained a collection of stolen goods, camping gear, electronics, medical supplies, items that clearly had been taken from the surface in a deliberate, organized way. The realization was chilling. For who knows how long, an entire community had been living beneath the mountains, surviving in total secrecy, stealing what they needed, and carefully watching everyone who came near their territory. They had the skills to shape the earth into livable spaces, and they had managed to remain hidden from every kind of authority. We eventually found the two missing cavers in a chamber nearly 4 miles from the entrance, far beyond where anyone had ever mapped before. They were alive but in bad condition, suffering from cold, dehydration, and exhaustion. More disturbing, they had been tied with ropes and crude shackles, held in place so they couldn't escape. They told us they had been taken by the underground people as soon as they entered the unmapped tunnels. Hidden openings had allowed the residents to watch them without being seen, and when the time was right, they were ambushed. The cavers had been held for more than 30 hours while their captors argued about what should be done with them. According to their description, these people had been living below the surface for years, maybe decades. They wore rough clothing made from animal skins mixed with scavenged materials, and they moved through the passages with perfect confidence, like they had been born into the caves. The most disturbing detail was that the community included children who had never once seen the sun or lived above ground. We freed the cavers and reported everything we had found to state and federal authorities, but when officials later sent teams to investigate, they discovered the passages had been deliberately destroyed. Explosives had collapsed sections of the cave, sealing off the very areas where we had found the settlement. Every trace of their existence had been wiped out. The final report listed only that 2 missing cavers had been rescued from an unmapped portion of Blackwater Cave. The evidence of habitation was filed away as inconclusive, and no follow-up was ever made. To prevent anyone from going back, the entrance was closed off with steel bars, and the area was declared off-limits to cavers. But I know what we saw, and I know the truth of what lives under those mountains. There are people who chose to vanish into the earth long ago, living by their own rules and staying hidden by whatever means necessary. They know how to erase their presence, and they will destroy anything that threatens their secrecy. The Appalachian Mountains have always sheltered families who preferred isolation, and some of those families simply never returned to the surface. They carved out lives in the dark, building homes where no government would ever look, and they have remained there ever since. 6 months later, I transferred to a new district and stopped working cave rescues altogether. Some things are too dangerous to uncover, and some communities have earned the silence that protects them, no matter how unsettling their ways of keeping that silence might be. The caves beneath Appalachia stretch farther than any map has ever shown, and they guard secrets older and darker than anyone above ground dares to imagine. I have been guiding hunters through the backcountry of Pennsylvania's Allegheny Mountains for more than 20 years, working with clients from all over the country who want to pursue white-tailed deer, black bear, and wild turkey in some of the wildest land left on the East Coast. The Alleghenies are part of the Appalachian chain, with ridges of hardwood forests, steep slopes, and deep hollows that have given shelter to animals long before settlers ever arrived. My guiding business focuses on backcountry hunts, taking clients far away from crowded camps and marked trails. These are serious hunters who want the challenge of days spent hiking rough terrain, sleeping under the stars, and hunting in places untouched by human scent or noise. Our trips usually lasted 5 to 7 days, with clients carrying their own gear and camping at remote sites that I chose based on years of studying deer movements and seasonal patterns. These mountains have been hunted for thousands of years, first by native tribes and later by settlers, whose families have kept traditions alive through generations. The local hunters know the old rules, respect the family grounds, share warnings of danger, and stay quiet in the woods if you hope to see anything. In October of 2019, I was hired to guide 4 men from Texas who wanted to hunt trophy whitetails in the most remote parts of the Alleghenies. They weren't beginners. They had hunted across North America and were looking for the challenge of thick forest and steep climbs that Pennsylvania still offers. They were well prepared, in good shape, and used to wilderness conditions. I chose a site 25 miles from the nearest road, reached only by hiking across national forest land and fording creeks with no trails or bridges. The area was known for big bucks, but required a 3-day hike to reach, which meant few, if any, other hunters ever bought. Haired to make the effort. We set camp beside a cold spring-fed creek that cut through a natural clearing, perfect for deer movement and easy access to multiple ridges. I had hunted the spot for over a decade and knew the patterns well. On the first morning, we split into 2 groups to cover more ground, keeping radios for safety. 2 men worked the ridge above camp, while the other 2 hunted the valley floor. I stayed central to keep contact with both. By midday, they were already spotting deer, and 1 man took a mature doe. By evening, both groups returned with good reports. The first day went as expected, and spirits were high. But as we ate dinner around the stove, I began to notice something off. All through the evening, sounds carried from the forest around us. Snapping branches, heavy movement, but not like deer or bear. The noises came from different directions, almost coordinated, circling our camp. Every so often, I heard faint calls, almost like human voices, but too far to make out. In my 20 years guiding hunts here, I had crossed paths with other parties only a handful of times, and always in easier-to-reach spots. This deep in the mountains, it was nearly impossible. Whoever was out there had to know the land and the routes as well as I did, and that knowledge didn't sit right with me. My clients were skilled hunters, and they noticed the oddness of it too. The night passed without rest for any of us, every man listening for the sounds outside the tents. By the second day, things escalated. Both hunting groups found signs that others were in the area, tree stands in places I knew had been empty weeks before, trails showing fresh boot prints. But the worst discovery came when we stumbled across deer carcasses. The animals hadn't been taken for food. They were gutted, their bodies left to rot, arranged in patterns that looked deliberate. Some were stripped of only certain parts, the rest left untouched. The way the carcasses were lined up seemed to point toward our camp, almost like a warning. Whoever had done it knew exactly where we were. Even more unsettling, we realized we were being shadowed. Both groups saw footprints matching their own trails, as if someone had been following them step for step while staying hidden. The prints weren't from one person, but from several, working in a way that let them surround and track us without being seen. That afternoon, one of the Texans reported something stranger still. He was being followed by someone who wasn't even trying to stay silent. Instead, they were deliberately making noise, breaking branches, scraping trees, and mimicking the alarm calls deer make when they sense danger. Each time the hunter moved, the sounds followed, pushing game away and making it impossible to hunt in peace. The way we were being harassed was too organized to be random. It was clear that whoever was behind it understood hunting well enough to ruin every chance we had of success. When the groups finally returned to camp that evening, we discovered something far more unsettling. Our camp had been visited. Nothing was stolen, nothing was broken, but every piece of gear had been touched and moved in a way that made it clear someone had gone through everything we owned. Food containers had been opened and carefully resealed. Personal items were shifted around, and even our hunting licenses and IDs had been examined. What shook us most was the crude map drawn in the dirt right beside our campfire, showing the exact locations of all our hunting spots from the past 2 days. Someone had been following us closely, tracking our every move, and keeping detailed notes about where we went and what we did. That night, things escalated in a way none of us were prepared for. Voices began to call out from the dark woods surrounding our camp, and they weren't random shouts. They spoke our names. They recited our home addresses. They mentioned our families and our businesses, using details that you'd only have come from our identification cards. The threats they made were personal, detailed, and terrifying, proof that these people weren't bluffing. The voices also showed that they knew our gear inside and out, describing items we had brought with us, but weren't using at that moment, things that had been in our packs earlier. That meant they had been close enough, for long enough, to watch everything we were doing. The realization settled on us heavy. We were being watched every second we had been there, our every step and move tracked by people who knew this land far better than we did. The pressure it created was unbearable. We weren't just outnumbered, we were surrounded by people who had the advantage of terrain, knowledge, and complete control over the situation. They knew our gear, our hunting paths, our identities, and everything about us. Just before dawn on our third day, one of the Texas hunters keeping watch saw what we had all feared. Multiple figures were moving through the trees, slowly surrounding our camp. They weren't stumbling or clumsy. Their movements were precise, coordinated, almost military in the way they advanced and signaled to each other in silence. Whoever they were, they knew exactly what they were doing. Faced with the certainty of being trapped, we decided not to wait. We broke down camp in the darkness, grabbing only what we could carry and abandoned the rest. The hike back was brutal. We were loaded light, but still forced into a pace that felt like a retreat from something closing in on us. And all the while, we knew we weren't alone. Figures moved along the ridges, and shadows kept pace with us through the trees. They weren't hiding anymore. They wanted us to see them. They walked just far enough away to avoid direct contact, but close enough to make their message perfectly clear. We were being escorted out of their land. By the time we reached our trucks, none of us had been touched, but the effect was permanent. The Texans canceled all future hunts in Pennsylvania, warning others never to come. The silent intimidation had worked far better than any open fight ever could. I did what I had to and filed reports with both state and federal officials, but it led nowhere. No crimes could be proven. We had been on public land, where anyone was allowed, and the situation was written off as nothing more than hunters arguing over territory. Nothing was done. But word spreads in places like this, and I soon learned that we weren't the only ones. Other guides and hunters had their own stories of being driven out of remote areas by people who used the same calculated methods. This wasn't about family traditions or casual hunters defending old grounds. These were groups with training, organization, and enough equipment to claim territory as if it were their own. They used fear, surveillance, and intimidation to keep people away, and they had the ability to back up every threat they made. After what happened, I shut down my guiding business for good and moved my family out of Pennsylvania. Some areas in the Appalachian Mountains simply don't belong to outsiders anymore. There are people who have claimed them, and they don't care what laws or government boundaries say. They enforce their own rules with their own authority, and those rules don't leave space for anyone else. I maintained the remote hiking trails in Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 8 years, working mostly alone in areas where fewer than a dozen people ever set foot in a year. The Smokies hold some of the most untouched wilderness in the eastern U.S., with more than 800 square miles of protected forest that has barely changed since the Cherokee walked those valleys. My job was simple: keep trails open, mark paths, clear fallen trees, repair bridges, and keep records so hikers wouldn't be caught by surprise. The work meant long stretches in total isolation, following routes that were sometimes little more than game trails marked with fading paint blazes. Many of these paths had once been Cherokee hunting trails before being added to the park system. Some ended at waterfalls or ridges with views marked on maps, while others simply vanished into the wild without destination. The Smokies are famous for heavy fog and thick canopies that turn daylight into gloom, making it easy to lose direction. The terrain rises and falls in steep ridges and tight valleys, a maze where even experienced hikers can disappear. Over the years, I learned never to rely on what I saw. Compass and topo maps were the only safe way to travel, because storms, slides, or seasonal growth could change the look of the forest overnight. In the spring of 2018, I was given the job of restoring the Appalachian Connector, a trail running about 12 miles through a remote northern stretch of the park. It hadn't been touched in 2 years thanks to budget cuts, so my task was to clear it and update its conditions. The trail started from a gravel service road parking lot and quickly sank into deep forest, where sunlight barely touched the ground. White blazes marked the path, but many had worn away or were hidden behind vines, making navigation difficult. By mid-morning, I reached a spot where the trail no longer matched my map. The route on paper said it should stay along a ridge, but the blazed path dropped into a valley not listed anywhere. The paint was the same as the official marks, the same shade of white, so I assumed it was a reroute done for safety. I followed it for half a mile, expecting to reconnect with the ridge, but instead I came out into a place I'll never forget. The valley opened into a wide clearing, about 100 yards across, completely stripped of plants. The ground was bare earth, unnatural in a park where everything grows thick and fast. Around the edge of the clearing, wooden posts had been hammered into the dirt, each one topped with a boot or a piece of gear. Some boots were old, weathered by years of sun and rain, while others looked new, placed only recently. As I walked the perimeter, it hit me. This was a collection built over time, from hikers who had passed through these mountains. Men's boots, women's boots, cheap day hiker shoes, high-dollar expedition gear. Decades of styles and brands lined the circle. But the boots were only the beginning. Inside the circle were neat rows of gear, packs, hiking sticks, bottles, tents, and other belongings, all cleaned and arranged with care, as if on display. And then I saw the part that chilled me the most. On flat stones laid near the center, IDs had been carefully arranged. Driver's licenses, park passes, club membership cards, all sealed under plastic to keep them safe from the weather. They carried names and faces from across the country, stretching back more than 15 years. Some I recognized, names tied to missing hikers whose stories had been whispered about for years in the park. That's when I realized what I had stumbled on. This was no accident. For more than a decade, someone had been intercepting hikers in the backcountry, stripping them of their gear and keeping it as trophies. The trail I had followed wasn't a park reroute at all. It had been marked and maintained deliberately to guide wanderers here. It was a sasur etap meant to steer hikers away from the official trail and guide them into a place where they could be trapped by whoever had been watching visitors for years. As I took photos of the strange clearing, it hit me that the site was still being maintained. Some gear looked like it had been moved recently, and the arrangement of the items showed careful adjustments as if new pieces were added over time. The plastic that covered the IDs was spotless, clear of dirt or weathering, meaning someone came often to care for the display. Even worse was the discovery that I had been under watch myself. At the edge of the clearing, a hand-drawn map had been pinned up, showing all the places I had worked during the past 2 days, my campsites, my maintenance routes, even the exact times I had been in certain areas. Whoever was behind this wasn't just keeping old trophies. I had unknowingly become their next target. I didn't waste another second. I left the clearing and tried to get back to the main trail with the help of my compass and GPS, but I quickly realized the blazes that had led me there weren't meant to guide me back out. The markings had been designed as a one-way system, pulling hikers into the trap with no marked exit. For 6 long hours, I fought my way through dense forest with no trail, using only the ridges and valleys on my map to figure out where I was. All the while, I felt the unmistakable sense of being tracked. I heard soft footsteps echoing mine, movements in the brush that matched my pace, and sometimes deliberate noises made just close enough so I would know I wasn't alone. It was as if someone wanted me to understand I was being followed but not see them. When I finally stumbled onto a marked trail, I radioed headquarters and demanded immediate help. But by the time the response team reached the location the next day, everything had been erased. The clearing couldn't be found. The hidden trail had been disguised as little more than animal paths, and every false blaze had either been scraped off or painted over. No trace remained. The officials marked my report down as confusion from exhaustion, stress, or isolation, suggesting I might have been disoriented. I was ordered to take time off and undergo evaluation for what they assumed was mental strain. Yet just 3 weeks later, another worker came forward with something that supported my account. A park maintenance employee uncovered a hidden stash of hiking gear inside a cave, along with identification documents belonging to people who had gone missing over the years. That single discovery forced a larger investigation that drew in federal law enforcement. The investigation confirmed what I already knew deep down. Someone, or maybe a group, had been deliberately targeting hikers, changing trail markers, to funnel them into hidden ambush spots, then taking their equipment and IDs to store as twisted trophies. It turned out there wasn't just one site, but several spread across the park, each one holding years, even decades, of items linked to missing people. Some sites held evidence stretching back more than 20 years. Whoever was behind it had deep knowledge of the trails and had perfected their methods for avoiding patrols and hiding their tracks. For months, undercover officers patrolled as hikers, but no suspects were caught. While the activity slowed under the heavy watch, it picked up again the moment law enforcement scaled down. 6 months later, I requested a transfer and left the Smokies behind. I never again worked alone in the backcountry. That experience taught me a truth I wish I didn't know, that the most dangerous predators in the wilderness aren't always animals. Some are people who have mastered the art of using isolation and terrain against unsuspecting travelers. Today, millions of visitors still come to the Smoky Mountains each year, most leaving with wonderful memories. But I know that deep in those ancient woods, some still see hikers not as visitors, but as prey. Trophies to be added to displays that may stretch back generations. The trails I once helped keep safe have been altered in ways no map could show, trails that quietly guide hikers to places they were never meant to reach. The displays may have been hidden deeper or disguised better since I found them, but they are still out there, growing, carefully tended by those who have turned human hunting into a long, unbroken tradition. I spent 5 summers working alone in a fire tower in the mountains of northern Georgia, 60 feet above the treetops with a view that stretched endlessly in every direction. Fire tower work is one of the loneliest jobs in forestry, demanding that servers spend months in total solitude, watching for smoke on the horizon and staying in touch with distant dispatch stations by radio. My post was on Bear Mountain, a peak rising above the rest of the forest like a natural lookout, giving a clear view over nearly 50,000 acres of wilderness. The tower itself was an old steel structure from the 1940s, topped with a small cabin that served as both home and workspace. To reach it, I had to climb a straight ladder that ran up the side, a climb that became second nature after a while, though storms and high winds always made it dangerous. From that tower, I learned to read the forest like it was alive. I could tell the difference between a campfire and a wildfire from miles away, predict storms by the shapes of distant clouds, and notice even the smallest changes in the horizon. The job was repetitive, but it gave me a rare view of untouched nature, something very few people ever get to witness. Northern Georgia's Appalachian wilderness stretched out in every direction from my tower, an ocean of ridges, valleys, and dark hollows. From above, I could see places with no roads, no trails, and no trace of human presence. Forests that had likely never seen a chainsaw or bulldozer. For the first 3 summers, the work was exactly what I expected. Watching, waiting, keeping the equipment working, reporting weather, and scanning for smoke. Wildlife kept me company. Bears, deer, turkeys, and sometimes elk wandering below. Nights filled with the sounds of the forest, a constant chorus of calls, wings, and rustling that eventually became as steady and familiar as my own breathing. But in my 4th summer, things changed. I began noticing something that didn't fit into the natural order of the woods. On clear nights when the sky was wide open, I started seeing lights where no lights should have been. At first, I thought I was seeing campers or night hikers, small lanterns or flashlights moving under the trees, but soon it became obvious these weren't cashews. Owl wanderers. The lights moved in straight lines across terrain no one could cross in darkness without a trail. They appeared in different places at the same time, distances apart that would take hours to hike. And they didn't move randomly. They moved with purpose, with coordination, as if they followed invisible paths. I began to track them, logging the dates, times, weather, and every pattern I could see. Night after night, they came back, often half the week, always when skies were clear. Through binoculars and a scope, I could see they were definitely human-made lights, but carried by people who knew the land as if they had built it. They moved at steady speeds, crossing valleys and ridges with uncanny precision. From above, I noticed the patterns they made, geometric shapes, formations that reminded me of military drills or coordinated search sweeps. Groups of lights would meet at certain spots, stop for long stretches, then split off in different directions, tracing new shapes as they went. Over the summer, the logs filled with patterns that told a story. These were not random campers. This was organized activity, carried out by people who knew exactly what they were doing, and it wasn't small. The lights appeared across my entire view, covering miles of land at once. Whoever they were, there were many of them, working together, hidden in the forests that were supposed to be empty. The scale of it gnawed at me. I wasn't watching scattered groups. I was seeing operations spanning hundreds of square miles, happening right under the nose of the Forestry Service. By the 5th summer, it escalated. The formations grew more complex, the nights stretched longer, and what unsettled me most was that sometimes the groups seemed to converge, heading toward the same hidden valleys and hollows I couldn't see into from the tower. I began to notice smoke the next mornings, thin columns rising from those same areas, suggesting fires or camps far from any known sites. Planes that usually flew their scheduled survey routes would sometimes change course, skirting the regions where lights had been active the night before. The realization pressed heavily on me. I was witnessing something vast, something human, and something deliberately hidden. These weren't scattered wanderers. This was organized life in the wilderness, carried out with military precision, and on a night in late August, it all reached a level I had never seen before. As I tried to leave the forest and bring what I had found to law enforcement, it became clear that I was no longer moving alone. I noticed fresh footprints running alongside my own paths, showing that someone had been shadowing me, step for step. Then came the worst discovery. My own camp had been tampered with. Gear had been shifted, items inspected, small signs left behind that told me plainly I was under constant watch. The realization that unseen eyes were tracking my every move hit harder than anything else. These people had already proven they were willing to kill in order to protect their operation, and now I was their target. I was outnumbered, deep in remote woods, surrounded by people who knew the terrain better than I ever could, and who had every reason to silence me before I could alert anyone. Panic set in. I cut short the rest of my harvesting trip, grabbed only the most essential gear, and left everything else behind so I could move faster through the thick terrain. On my retreat, the sense of being followed only grew stronger. Movement in the trees, signs in the mud, the eerie quiet that told me others were close, adjusting their pace to keep me in sight. Then came the most terrifying discovery of all, new traps. The routes I had used before to exit the forest now held crude but deadly devices, hastily constructed yet effective enough to cripple or kill. It was clear someone had guessed my escape paths and rigged them to stop me from ever reaching safety. My only chance was to rely on hidden paths I had memorized over the years, faint routes that hunters rarely used. For nearly 24 hours, I moved without rest, cutting across unmarked ridges, avoiding trails, and refusing to stop even when exhaustion set in. Somehow, it worked. I slipped past the traps and the watchers and finally reached the parking lot where my truck sat waiting. Relief lasted only seconds. The vehicle had been searched. The contents shifted just enough for me to notice, and when I checked underneath, I found tracking devices clamped to the frame. Whoever they were, they had planned to follow me long after I left the forest. I didn't waste a second. I drove straight to the nearest law enforcement office, handed over every detail I had, and gave them GPS coordinates for the camps, the traps, the drying racks, everything. They sent investigators back into the forest, but by the time anyone arrived, it was all gone. The traps had been dismantled, the camps cleared, and the processing stations stripped bare. It was as though the entire operation had melted into the trees overnight, leaving nothing behind but disturbed soil. The official word was predictable. They said I had stumbled on nothing more than small-time poaching camps that had been abandoned once the people involved realized they were discovered. No charges, no further digging, just a clean dismissal. But stories have a way of slipping through the cracks. Talking with other hunters, I learned I wasn't alone. Others had found the same things in the hills of southern Ohio and even across the borders into Kentucky and West Virginia. Hunters spoke in hushed tones about large-scale ginseng destruction, operations too organized and too widespread to be simple poaching. Some had been threatened, others chased from the woods, and a few were rumored never to have returned at all. What I had stumbled into was only a piece of something much larger, a network spread across hundreds of miles of forest, defended with ruthless precision. These weren't just opportunists stripping roots from the ground. They were part of a system, a criminal enterprise backed by resources, manpower, and an iron grip on the land. The way they operated left no doubt. They tracked intruders, destroyed evidence when threatened, and made sure no one who truly endangered their profits ever walked away to talk about it. It wasn't just about plants anymore. It was about territory, control, and a shadow economy hidden beneath the trees. After that experience, I made my choice. I gave up ginseng hunting in remote areas and moved my family far from Ohio. To this day, the hills there still grow some of the finest wild ginseng in America, but those slopes and hollows are no longer open to tradition. They are controlled land, patrolled by people who treat every outsider as a target. The old ways of careful harvesting and family secrets are gone, replaced by strip mining the forest floor under the shield of violence. What once were quiet, generational harvest grounds have turned into killing fields where law holds no weight and intruders vanish without trace. Music. I spent 2 years doing geological surveys in the most remote parts of the Appalachian Mountains between 2017 and 2019, looking for mineral deposits and mapping cave systems that had never been fully explored. The work demanded weeks of solitude, hiking for days into trackless wilderness where no trails led and no roads reached. My assignment stretched from southern Pennsylvania to northern Georgia, studying the ancient bones of the Appalachians, a mountain chain older than almost any on Earth. These mountains were born hundreds of millions of years ago, their violent birth leaving behind a maze of underground caverns, mineral veins, and strange formations still waiting to be discovered. I carried ground-penetrating radar, seismic sensors, and endless notebooks, scanning the depths for hidden chambers and then crawling through the stone itself to confirm what the machines suggested. The work led me into places no human had likely ever stepped. Some caves yawned open behind boulders. Others hid in valleys where only deer trails wound through. Reaching them required ropes, harnesses, and light gear designed for men who expected to vanish underground for days. The Appalachian cave systems are vast beyond imagination, some stretching for hundreds of miles, linking mountain to mountain like a secret network beneath the earth. During my first year alone, I charted dozens of new caverns and mineral deposits, contributions that shifted the geological understanding of the region. It was grueling, dangerous work, but the reward was entering worlds that existed in total darkness, untouched by human hands. Then, in October of 2018, I found something that still keeps me awake at night. Deep in Kentucky's Daniel Boone National Forest, radar had suggested a hidden chamber. After climbing through narrow valleys and crossing rope lines over creeks, I found the entrance, tucked behind a rockfall. At first glance it seemed natural, but closer inspection revealed otherwise. The rocks had been carefully stacked, arranged to conceal a passage invisible unless you were right on top of it. Whoever built it didn't want casual discovery. Inside, the cave sprawled far larger than the radar hinted. Tunnels branched off into webs of side passages, rising and falling in levels that twisted into a three-dimensional maze. But the deeper I went, the stranger it became. The walls bore signs of tools, hand-worked enlargements where stone had been chipped away. Chambers had been carved smooth, shaped with clear purpose. And then I saw the truth. This wasn't just a cave, it was a home. Sleeping areas, food caches, and workshops filled the spaces. Whoever lived here had mastered survival underground, and not just for days. This had gone on for decades, maybe longer. But the most disturbing part was how they had adapted. Tools were built for use without sight, designed to be handled purely by feel. Food was stored and processed with methods that required no light at all. The preserved meats I tested later weren't from any diet a surface human would survive. They were consuming things we would consider poisonous. Social structures showed the same adaptation. Privacy didn't exist. Everything was communal, survival bent toward the group rather than the individual. The deeper I studied, the more it became obvious. These weren't just people living underground. They had become something different. Their bodies had changed. Sleeping alcoves built for smaller frames, tools meant for hands stronger and nimbler than ours. Child-rearing chambers indicated programs of breeding for traits, better hearing, finer touch, sharper resistance to illness. Some storage rooms held medicines not for our common sicknesses, but for strange conditions that came only from underground life. Generations had passed. Said here, enough time for real biological shifts, creating a people molded by darkness itself. And as I pressed deeper, I realized how vast this was. The system connected to others, a lattice of tunnels running for miles, a secret network that linked mountains across entire states. Populations could move through it unseen, emerging only when needed, and they had been watching us. One chamber stopped me cold. Maps of the surface, trails marked, campsites circled, towns noted in careful detail, notes on human movement, supply points, even names. They weren't just hiding, they were monitoring us. Supplies had been stolen without notice, and worse, evidence showed people had been taken. Not rumors, not myth, taken. Materials I found suggested breeding programs that mixed surface humans with cave dwellers, diversifying their blood while enhancing underground traits. They had been capturing outsiders, holding them in chambers I saw with my own eyes. When I finally turned back, I knew I was already in danger. Routes I had used before were blocked, new passages opened, guiding me into traps. They wanted me cornered, caught, Only by forcing my way into unmapped tunnels, climbing where no one else had gone, did I manage to break free. When I reached the surface, I reported everything, but by the time officials checked, the cave was gone, collapsed by explosives, sealed tight. Every trace erased, every passage destroyed. The records say I found signs of illegal mining and nothing more. The site is closed, off limits now, and no further action was taken. But I know the truth. Somewhere beneath the Appalachians, human populations exist that are no longer truly like us. They have evolved, generation after generation, selecting traits for darkness, for silence, for secrecy. They live in vast networks we will never see, with abilities we cannot match, and they know us better than we know them. The mountains shelter them still, and they will remain hidden for as long as they wish. I coordinated search and rescue operations across 3 states in Appalachia for 14 years, dealing with missing hikers, hunters, campers, and anyone else who disappeared in the vast wilderness areas that stretch from southern Pennsylvania to northern Georgia. Search and rescue work in the Appalachian Mountains presents unique challenges due to the dense forest cover, complex terrain, and weather patterns that can change rapidly and create life-threatening conditions for anyone caught unprepared in the backcountry. The Appalachian Mountains contain some of the most extensive wilderness areas in the eastern United States, with millions of acres of protected forest that are accessible only on foot through trail systems that range from well-maintained recreational paths to unmarked routes that require advanced navigation skills.